Let's start adding a cube, and let's make it a smoke domain. Now let's add another cube, and this time we're going to make it a smoke flow. It is very important to set the surface to 0, volume to 1, and temperature diffuse to 0. It is also important to rename our items, so let's rename both the emitter and the domain properly, and also let's make the emitter invisible in OpenGL. We can now start our preview render, and of course change to object, select the domain object, and assign a new material. Let's name it clouds. And now we can delete the universal material and add the volume medium and attach it to the volume input. We can now change some parameters. Let's set both absorption and scattering to pure white and the volume step length at 0.1. And now let's add a noise texture and attach it to the scattering texture input. We can increase the contrast and the octaves. Now let's add a 3D transform node, so we can change the scale of the texture to 4 in this case, or 8, and yeah, you can see the difference. We can play with the gamma. We can also, of course, change the density, or the omega to add more detail to the texture, but more importantly, we can add a gradient texture. This will allow us to better control the scattering values. Basically, we are modulating the noise values using the gradient. Now let's go back in world mode and let's change the lighting direction, simply dragging on the sphere. So now that's what we have in our preview render back in object mode, and let's see how we can change the scale values in real time, but also the position of the texture on all 3 axes and the rotation, so we have full control over the transformation of the procedural noise in the volume. Now let's go back in world mode and let's add another environment. This time we're going to use a text environment plugged into the Octane visible environment. We can now work with a totally black backdrop, which gives us a clear vision of the volume. Now let's select the first keyframe of the gradient, and let's select the blue color. Now let's make it darker. We can play with the gradient, changing the position of the keyframes, and see how that affects the render. So we can control not only the density and the color of the clouds, we can also control the color of the sky, which is great. We have definitely full control over how the cloud should look. Now let's go back in world mode and let's drag an HDRI image into the model editor. I'm going to use the KPL8K. We also need to add a new texture environment node. Let's connect the texture and then the Octane environment, and let's change the gamma to 1. Let's also disable visible environment backplate so we can see the HDRI. If we observe our cloud, we can clearly see how the bounding box is somehow cutting our volume, and that's not something we really want. But there's a solution to this problem. We can select the domain and make it bigger, scaling it in edit mode, and then we can also select the emitter, make it visible, and in edit mode scale it on the Z, subdivide it a little bit, and make it so it's totally inside the volume. Now we can go back in object mode and disable the preview, simulate again, and make the emitter invisible again. Let's activate the visible environment backplate and change the color to blue. Let's go in object mode again. Let's change the gradient texture values, but also the point of view. And back in word mode, let's increase the power of the HDRI. Now let's go back in object mode and change the gamma a little bit to get a slightly different result in our render. And from the numeric panel, let's activate the Octane camera imager and then the spectral AI denoiser. You should also change the response to sRGB, and from the passes select the denoiser beauty pass. So now we should be able to see the effects of the AI denoiser, and just after a few seconds and a few samples we should be able to see a noise-free image. Of course, the more samples we're using, more detail we're getting. We can also use the blend option to blend between the denoised image and the normal render. Now we can change some parameters like density. Let's try with 25. Also change the phase, which controls the front and back scattering. And more in general, experiment with the parameters we have. So we can play with the gradient texture node, we can change the density, we can work on the volume step length value. And it's very important to notice that the volume step length value should be proportional to the scale of your object. And also the density should be decreased in case you have really big scale clouds or volumes. That's all for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time.